Okay, good morning, everybody. We're going to start in just a few minutes. We'll give everyone time to get in. I'm Claire. I'll be moderating the panel today. I work as an interpreter at the European Parliament. Our panelists can briefly say hi if they would like.
Hi, everyone.
Hello. Good morning, everyone.
And we'd love to hear who's in our audience. So if you want to, in the chat, just tell us your name, where you're joining from, what languages you speak. We'd love to hear who we have and who we're talking to. Good morning. Someone's in Budapest. Good morning, Nora. Everyone's quite shy this morning, it seems. Anybody else? Someone in Newcastle, Romania. Okay, the ball's rolling. Okay, so we'll give everyone a bit more time just to arrive and get started. Just a few bits of information before we really launch into the panel. You can use the chat function to introduce yourselves and everything like that. We'll start with a bit of a panel discussion, and then afterwards we'll move on to questions and answers from the audience, which I think is probably going to be the most interesting part for most of you. If you have questions and answers, rather than using the chat function, it would be best to use the question and answer function. You'll find that at the bottom of your screens. Use the questions and answers, and we'll go through those after we've got through the talk to begin with. Who else do we have joining us this morning? Do we have a few more? Hungarian, Romanian, excellent. So before we start, I can see we have a couple of translation and interpreting students here with us. I'm just going to launch a quick poll so we can see exactly who everyone is, who already studies languages, who doesn't. So if I can launch the poll. One second, there we go. So if you could all just tell us, I'll give you half a minute or so to tell us which of these best describes you. Okay, we've got a few answers. Everybody answered? A few more have... Is that everyone? Okay. See if I can share the results with you. So most of us are studying languages or may study them in the future. One or two are studying interpreting. A bit of a nice mix, I would say. And just one more question to see, because we're going to focus on interpreting for the European Union. So I'd like to know how much you all know about the European Union. It's not going to be an exam, don't worry, but I'm just, without Googling, who knows how many official languages there are in the European Union? Oh, that was quick. Okay, is that everyone voted? Okay, let's see. So some of you, well, most of you were right. 24 languages is correct. 27 is the number of member states these days, since one left. And 3 would be the number of working languages. So we have English, French, and German as the working languages, but officially there are 24 official EU languages. Okay, so that was just a bit of background. As I said earlier, for those of you who joined us a little bit late, you're welcome to say hi to everyone in the chat and say your name and where you're joining from. But if you have any questions, it's best if you put them in the question and answer function at the bottom, and then we'll be able to get to them later on in the talk. So enough from me, time to hear from the panelists. Panelists, could you just introduce yourselves? Tell us who you are, which languages you have, and a bit about your background, how you got to where you are today. Perhaps we can start with Owen. Go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Claire. Good morning, everyone. My name is Owen Ward. I'm an interpreter working for the European Commission, employed by the European Commission's interpreting service. I'm originally from Northern Ireland, from a very monolingual family. I'm actually at my family's home at the moment. A very nice family, but nothing in my family background made me think that I would go into interpreting at all. I studied French at school. I studied French and Irish at school, but sadly Irish went by the wayside. And then I picked up Spanish at university, and then later on I picked up German. So that's my language combination now. I work from French, Spanish, and German into English. I came into interpreting a little bit later in life. So I graduated when I was around 22. And for around 10 years, I lived and worked in a number of different countries, in France and Spain and in the UK. And then I decided that interpreting was the right career path for me. So I went back to university and studied a master's in interpreting at the University of Manchester. And then after that, I got accredited by the EU institutions and gradually picked up a bit of experience working as a freelancer, then became a temporary member of staff, and now I'm a fully fledged member of staff at the European Commission. So that's all from me for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And perhaps Phoebe, what about you? Did you have a similar path, or was yours a bit different?
Thanks, Claire. Good morning, everyone. Well, like Owen, I also grew up in a purely English-speaking family in London. I'm in London today, actually. Sadly, not with you all in person, but I can see that it's nice and sunny, which is great. I studied French and Italian at school, and then decided to do languages at university. So I did French and Italian. I actually went straight from my BA in languages to a master's in interpreting. At the end of my BA, someone came to speak about the interpreting course at the University of Bath. So I decided to go for it, and I went straight on to do my master's in interpreting. Once I got my master's, I went to live in Italy for a bit. I worked as a translator for a law firm, and then I became a freelance interpreter accredited for European institutions, started off as a freelancer. Then 5 years ago, I became a staff member at the European Court of Justice, which is where I currently work.
Okay, thank you very much, Phoebe. And Matthew, what about you?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Matthew. I'm an interpreter at the European Parliament Interpreting Service. And sorry to be boring, but I also grew up in a monolingual English household. But a few other differences, perhaps. I am a European citizen now, an EU citizen, so I can consider myself a European of British origin and monolingual origin, but I have lived and worked in several European countries and worked as a freelance for most of the European Union institutions. Also helped train interpreters, and I'm now on the staff of on a temporary contract at the European Parliament Interpreting Service. And the route in was I loved languages and literature, and that's what I did at university too. But my main interest was writing and performing comedy and theatre. And I had the typical dilemma that creative people have of how am I going to earn a living and also do something fun. And I didn't like the idea of being stuck in front of a computer or a dictionary all day doing translation. And interpreting seemed to be about people and about talking and person-to-person communication. And so once I got to grips with it, I was very daunted by it from the outside and thought you had to be, from a diplomatic family. I basically thought it was a very posh world and that ordinary people didn't stand a chance. But actually, I discovered if you have the languages, if you brush up on your general knowledge and kind of know what you're talking about, then you can have a lot of fun working with people as an interpreter, which I have done throughout my career, despite, the challenges one faces.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're perhaps all from similar family backgrounds. I'm also from a very monolingual family, but we've all taken slightly different routes to get to where we are today. Now, the audience probably noticed that Phoebe works for the Court of Justice, Owen works for the Commission, Matthew works for the Parliament. We're not going to go into great detail today about all the different parts of the European Union and how it fits together, but perhaps you could each just give us a bit of a summary, a bit of an explanation of what your institution is, how it fits in, and what it's like to interpret there. How does interpreting, is it the same in the court as in the Parliament, or what's specific about the institution where you work? Matthew, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So I would say the core people we're working for are members of the European Parliament who are elected. So we're part of that democratic process, which has to be multilingual because people are elected not on the basis of their language skills. And then they need to do deals, persuade each other, make compromises, persuade a broader audience, listen to experts, listen to what the other EU institutions have to say, consult civil society, consult citizens of Europe in the Conference on the Future of Europe. So there's a constant toing and froing of conversations, all of which have to happen without a language barrier. So people are there because they have a mandate to be there, and we are just there to serve them. But there's a vast range of different activities that they need to carry out in order to fulfill their mandate. And we're there to step in whenever it looks like a language barrier might get in the way, right up to plenary, where all 24 languages are covered officially, and MEPs from the entire European Union can speak in their mother tongue and be interpreted into all the other official languages of the European Union.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Before we go on, I'll just say, if you're looking at the chat, you might have noticed some messages from Diana. Diana also works for the EU and has posted some information already about the different interpretation services with a few links, so you can look at those. At the end, we'll post information about everything you need if you're interested in working for the EU. There'll be a QR code and all of the links. But if you follow what Diana's posting in the chat, then you'll be able to get some information already. Okay. And for questions, as I said, make sure to use the question and answer function rather than the chat, because it's easier for us to keep track. Having said that, Phoebe, what's it like working at the court? I would imagine it's quite different from what Matthew's just explained about the Parliament.
Yes, Claire, I think it's very different working at the court, I think. So just to give everybody a brief little bit of background. Oh, I forgot to mention my language combination earlier, so I'll rectify that now and say I work from French, Italian and Portuguese, and I'm working on Spanish. So the Court of Justice is the judicial authority of the European Union, and it ensures the uniform application of EU legislation across the different member states. So we, as interpreters at the court, we work primarily in hearings, which are public events. You can actually see them online, as they're now web streamed every Tuesday. And we work in cases of all types. So we work in state aid cases, competition cases involving big companies like Google, Amazon, Apple. Everything you hear in the news when these companies are being fined, that comes to us. Infringement proceedings against the member states when they don't fulfill their obligations under the legislation laid down across the union. And yes, it is very different working at the court. It can be quite intense. It's legal, but it's also so much fun. We work in so many different subject matters, as is true of the other institutions as well. But one day we might be working in something that's very much to do with farming subsidies or something like that, and the next day we could be talking about a trademark case for a vacuum cleaner or something. It's so many different exciting subject. Well, vacuum cleaners maybe not, but there's just so many different things that we work in. It really is very interesting.
And if I may, Phoebe, do you need to have a legal background? Do you need legal training in order to do something like that?
Actually, the interpreters are the only staff at the courts who do not have a legal qualification. So to work as an interpreter at the court, you don't need to have a legal background. I don't have a legal background. I worked as a translator briefly for a law firm in Italy, but in no way is it a requisite. We have some colleagues who do have law degrees, but you don't need one. I don't have one, that's for sure.
Okay. And Owen, what about the commission? That might seem to be the most mysterious of all of the institutions to some people. So what's work like there?
Okay, I'm not sure if it's that mysterious, but I see what you mean. Yes, it sounds often, you see it on the news with the EU flags in front of it, the Berlaymont building. Basically, the European Commission is like the government of the EU. It's divided into different directorate generals, which are a bit like ministries. And the job of the Commission is to propose legislation. And then that goes on a sort of a legislative journey. It goes to the Council, which is where the member states are represented. And then it goes to the Parliament. And they all work together. So yes, the Commission basically, it's often very technical meetings, a little bit like what Phoebe was saying, about vacuum cleaners and farming, subsidies and whatever. We do a lot of very technical meetings. So one day you might be in something on food labeling, the next day something on the common agricultural policy, then on customs or transport. So very kind of technical matters, and often in Commission meetings, they are very technical. They're experts who are kind of getting down to the nitty-gritty of a piece of legislation and saying, oh yes, maybe we could include this or take out that. And then we also work as the Commission service, we also work for the Council, and that's where the member states are represented. So something very technical will then go to the Council, and then the different member states will have their say. So maybe there's something in the original legislation which says, oh, well, this piece of legislation, something about transport, and they'll mention something like 300 kilometers. So that's fine in a big country like Germany or France, but the Maltese may put up their flag and say, well, 300 kilometers, you're no longer in Malta. So that's where the member states really have their say and talk about their specificities. And then we also work for two committees, for the European Economic and Social Committee and the Committee of the Regions. So the Economic and Social Committee is where the voice of civil society is heard. And the Committee of the Regions obviously represents the regions, and they're much more free-flowing. They're very different. So the Commission is very technical, the Council is more political, and then the committees are much more sort of, I wouldn't say exactly regular citizens, because they're people who are in a certain position, but they're people who speak much more freely. So as interpreters, we really enjoy working in those committees because of the sort of free-flowing nature of the discussions.
Okay, thank you very much. So quite a wide variety of different situations, and even working for one institution, there's still a lot of variety in the day-to-day job. So we've had a bit of background about our panelists and about interpreting in general, but perhaps we should move on to the topic of this panel, which is interpreting for me? How would somebody know if interpreting is for them? Perhaps our panelists can share, how did you know when did you know if interpreting was for you, or how did you know? What kind of, before you went into the profession, if you can remember that far back, what were your expectations, perhaps concerns or fears about the profession, and were they founded, or what was surprising, what was unexpected going into the job? Matthew, tell us about your experiences.
Okay, thanks. I can remember that far back. Thank you very much, Claire. I can remember back to when I was about 10 or 11 years old, which it was definitely another era. And we can take it for granted that you need languages, you need the general knowledge and the EU knowledge. Okay, I say take it for granted. We can talk about it later, but I didn't want to talk about it now. I wanted to plunge straight into something completely different, which is idiolects, the way individual people speak. So now if I could look back at my 10-year-old self and say, is interpreting for you? I would say yes, because I would hear mum saying, but you know, when I say A, I mean B. And my dad saying, well, if you mean B, just say B. Why do you have to say A and make me work it out? Right. And this is, it's not a big deal. It wasn't a traumatic childhood experience. But I was thinking they actually have a lot in common. And occasionally there's a difference of opinion where they need to identify exactly where it lies so that they can negotiate and maybe compromise. And there's so much getting in the way that they're not realizing how much they have in common. And they can't see where the genuine difference of opinion is because they think there's all kinds of other differences of opinion. And so I think I was doing what I do every single day at work now, which is listen to people who are human and are sometimes subject to human limitations on understanding of others. And we have to use our emotional intelligence, our empathy, all our understanding of context, all our linguistic knowledge, all our political knowledge at the Parliament, and instincts for strategy and rhetoric, persuasion, all of those things. But I would say all of those things are at the service of what is a basically very, very human frailty of people not quite understanding other people. And if we can step in, if the ostensible reason for that is they are literally speaking different languages, and like I said, I was from an English monolingual background, they were talking, they were speaking different languages to each other, but it was all English. But now there's ostensibly, officially, a different official EU language getting in the middle of it, and I'm helping, and it feels very, very similar. So if you've ever felt that, interpreting is for you.
Okay. And if Matthew ever gets bored of interpreting, perhaps a marriage counsellor would be his next step. Okay, Phoebe, what about you? What were you expecting going into the profession, and did it meet expectations? What are your thoughts?
Well, actually, I didn't consider interpreting until as I said, until I was at the very end of my bachelor's degree. I didn't know what I wanted to do. All I knew is that I wanted to use my languages. I didn't want to just, I don't know, maybe answer the phone and have a conversation every now and again in French or something, if I was lucky to land in a company that allowed me to do so. So I wanted to work with pure language. And so when I heard about interpreting, it clicked and made sense for me on that level, because I loved languages. I didn't really want to do anything else. I wanted to work with language. So from that moment on, it just made sense. Fears and expectations, I don't remember having a lot of time for them. When learning to interpret can be very intense. It's a lot of fun. It can be very intense though. And then I remember visiting the EU institutions, and really just made me even more determined. This is what I wanted to do. It just felt right. But coming back to what Matthew was saying about when he was younger, when I was younger, I was really strong at English. I really liked telling stories and writing stories as well. I was very into creative writing when I was younger. And I joined a storytelling club at school, and I remember doing that. And then when I was learning to interpret, I remember one of our professors saying, "Tell the story," when we were learning to interpret speeches. And it linked back to the fun I had when I was storytelling when I was a child. And interpreting is very much that as well. It's getting into it and telling the story of the speaker, communicating it in another language. So if you recognize that element in you, that you like to tell a story, and you can do it eloquently as well, hopefully, then I would say interpreting it can be a great career possibility for you.
I definitely recognize the idea of telling a story. I remember being told as well, you know, if all else fails, just imagine you're explaining it to your Italian friend's your Italian friend speaking, and you're explaining it to your grandmother. You know, you don't have to get hung up on every tiny word. Just what are they trying to say? Imagine you're explaining it to your auntie or your granny or someone who really has no idea. And yeah, sometimes we can forget that, I think. Owen, what about you? How has the career met your expectations?
Yeah, we're going to delve into my childhood now. I suppose looking back on it, I mean, I was always interested in languages and different cultures growing up, and I remember being very into things like maps. I'm in a room in my parents' house at the moment, and I'm seeing some stuff from some books from my childhood and whatever. And I was always very, very interested in maps and geography and where countries were and all of that. So I suppose from that point of view, being interested in different languages and different cultures, it was clear that interpreting has turned out to be the right job for me, because we need to keep that curiosity, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. It has definitely met it's exceeded my expectations in so many ways. I suppose just piggybacking on what Matthew said earlier on about the image of the profession, maybe that you need to be a diplomat's son or daughter, or you need to have gone to all of these international schools, and you know, you need to have been raised by, you know, a nanny from some country or something. I had none of that. So I think sometimes maybe the image of the profession needs to be updated a little bit. And that's what we're trying to do with events like this, really, to prove that it is just about, you know, learning your language at the school, at university, by living in the country, and then learning the skills of an interpreter. So as I was saying earlier on, I did my undergraduate degree and then did various different things. I worked as a teacher. I worked in sort of marketing, did different things. And interpreting was always at the back of my mind. And every so often, I don't see them so much anymore, but every so often there'd be an article in The Guardian or on the BBC website saying, oh, you know, the interpreting services of these various different institutions are looking for people, and, you know, their interpreters are getting older and there are a lot of retirements. So I always sort of had it in the back of my mind. So then I just started looking into it, and I saw that it was achievable, that it wasn't something that was, you know, a crazy goal, like, you know, becoming an astronaut or something. It was actually a job that you trained for like any other. So I think trying to demystify the image of the profession a little bit is really important. So that's why we're here today.
Definitely. I will just remind our audience, feel free to ask questions at any time. There aren't too many on the question and answer board at the moment, but please feel free, if anything occurs to you, just put it in there and we'll get to them all pretty soon. Owen referred to training the skills, learning languages, and then training the skills that you need to be an interpreter. What are those skills? Okay, we've said languages, but what specific skills can people work on already if they think this might be something that they're interested in? You can start us, Owen, since you mentioned that.
Yeah, well, I mentioned general knowledge, and I think that's incredibly important. And it doesn't mean being a know-it-all, you know, no one likes a know-it-all, but it means having, you know, a good general base level of knowledge through, you know, your GCSE, A-level, degree, all of that. And so that means knowing about history, about politics, about science, knowing a little bit about a lot of areas. I think we need very broad general knowledge rather than incredibly deep general knowledge. I think interpreters need to know a little bit about everything. And going back to my early days as well, from the end of primary school onwards, I was always in quiz teams. I'm still on a pub quiz team. And that's incredibly important. A lot of interpreters are good quizzers because we know a little bit about lots of things. So yeah, paying attention at school to, you know, what happened after the Second World War and all the, you know, the construction of the European institutions as they are today, having that base level. And then on top of that, you need intellectual curiosity. So that means when you see something on TV, you're not just going, oh, that's awful, what's happening in whatever country. You can say that, of course, that's a human reaction, but then trying to dig beneath the surface a little bit and saying, well, why is that situation going on in that particular country? Why do those two countries clash so often? Why are they fighting over that piece of land, etc.? So trying to kind of dig underneath the surface. So not just looking at the news. The problem with the news these days is that it's all very superficial and it moves very quickly. So you need to try and go a little bit deeper and try to understand the the context. And you can do that through various different things nowadays with all the resources at our disposal. I think most interpreters are podcast junkies. We listen to lots of podcasts. So, for example, the other day I was listening to a podcast about the Middle East and about all the problems there and why there is this conflict, this ongoing conflict. And also saying, you know, you should never say as an interpreter, that's not for me, that's not my thing. You need to know about everything and be interested in everything. So we work for the European institutions. I don't have Polish in my combination, for example, but there were the elections in Poland recently, so we needed to pay attention to that. So who are the different players? What are the different leanings? What are the main issues? Because it might come up in a meeting. You know, your French delegate might be very interested in what's happening in Poland and might raise it in the meeting. So don't limit yourself. Don't just say, oh yeah, you know, I'm a history buff, or I'm a science guy, or I'm into this or that or the other. As an interpreter, you should really have a very broad range of interests and be willing to go a little bit deeper.
Okay, thank you very much. And Matthew, what do you think are the skills that people need to be a good interpreter?
Look, it occurs to me listening to that, obviously we need the knowledge and we need the languages, but the skill I'd like to pick on is, I think, the other one, which is sometimes missing. Let's say we have the person with the perfect general knowledge, as Owen has described, and the language knowledge, because they're a language expert. When they're speaking, it sounds boring and borderline incomprehensible. You can't really fault the content of what they're saying, and you can't really fault it as a translation either. But there's something about the speaking to people which is not working for the audience. Someone takes their headphones off and says, I can't listen to that all day. I can't really follow what's going on. It could be the intonation, it could be to do with the delivery, but basically the public speaking skill, it may sound like a superficial one. It may sound like the sort of icing on the cake when everything else is there intellectually. But unfortunately, it is the first barrier to understanding. A translator doesn't need good handwriting anymore. You can type it up and everyone can read it, and you can send it electronically and everyone can read it. You have to go back hundreds of years for the translator to be writing it out by hand. But the interpreter's voice is still the only instrument for getting the message to the listener. And if the voice doesn't get that message across with all of its nuances, then the interpreter has failed.
Okay, interesting. I think that's not one that a lot of people would have thought of. And it's also one that is quite difficult to train, I should imagine. It means a lot of listening to yourself, which nobody particularly likes, do they? Phoebe, what kind of skills do you think budding interpreters should be working on?
Well, I have to say that it's what Matthew and Owen have said is extremely true, especially feeding back to what Owen said about how you have to know all of these things. When I started working at the court, I thought, excellent, I can forget about football and having to inform myself on how that works. Not the case when I got put in a FIFA hearing and or something along those lines, where I had to suddenly learn how the transfer of players worked between clubs, which ended up being very interesting. But so I just wanted to reinforce what Owen said. Everything is relevant when you're an interpreter. Well, I would say that, of course, maybe the first thing that you think of when you think is interpreting for me, do you like languages? Do you have the language skills to be an interpreter? Because, of course, it's a good place to start considering interpreting. And it was definitely the case for me. You obviously need a very solid knowledge of your passive languages that you're going to be interpreting from. Not only the languages themselves, but the culture that comes with it, because as any linguist knows, the culture is heavily entwined with the language itself. It influences the language. If you're familiar with the culture, then even when somebody has a moment of miscommunication, makes up an idiom, maybe you can see where they're coming from if you know the culture behind the language. And this is what really allows you to be the bridge of communication. That is what being an interpreter is all about. And I would add that it's not only your foreign languages that have to be strong. One of the things that initially surprised me, but actually makes total sense working as an interpreter, is that your mother tongue needs to be very strong. the language that you're working into. After all, it's all very well and good understanding what somebody has said, but if you cannot convey that in a way that sounds good in your mother tongue, in the right register, the right tone, then you're only really halfway there. So when you're under pressure, you really need to be agile and flexible in your mother tongue, so that you can follow the speaker down whatever twist and turn they take their speech in, and to make it sound natural and pleasant for your listener.
Okay, thank you very much. So if that's sounding appealing to any of our audience, what should they do? We already have a couple of questions in the question and answer function, both touching on this issue. What do people need to do if they want to become an interpreter? Are there specific qualifications that they need? Are there specific language requirements? Do they have to be able to work into a language that's not their mother tongue, for instance? Phoebe, could you perhaps tell us about that?
Well, starting out, if you want to come and work for the EU, it's a good idea once you've got your qualification, and I'll link this back to the second question. I've seen the first question about competitions for interpreters at the Courts of Justice. I will touch on that. But the way that I got started, really, once I had my qualification, I did as many. This is once you have as I said, once you have the qualification, just look for as many opportunities as you can. So I did a lot of volunteer jobs. I went and worked at the Milan Film Festival, which was a lot of fun. It was quite intimidating as my first experience, sat in front of a theatre full of people, but it was a very exciting one as well, and confirmed that interpreting was for me. So yes, and in terms of was I mentioning the qualifications specifically, Claire? Sorry.
Yeah, perhaps just briefly, if you could let people know what qualifications, are there any formal qualifications that are required? What would they be?
Sorry, I had a momentary Saturday blip. So yes, if you want to become an interpreter working for the institutions, you need to have a degree in conference interpreting or a postgraduate diploma in conference interpreting. So you can find information on where to find courses, I think in the QR code that we'll show you at the end of this session. You don't need any specific languages. Most interpreters start out with a combination of what we call the big five, so French, English, German, Italian, Spanish, most of the languages that you would learn at school, or you don't need any exotic combinations to start off with.
All the information is available on the website. So I would just point out that depending on what your mother tongue is, the requirements may vary. So if English is your mother tongue, then you currently need French or German plus one other language. But if your mother tongue is Italian, then there are different requirements. And that does vary depending on what the needs of the institutions are. So just keep an eye on the website that will be put up at the end. So we've heard a bit about what makes a good interpreter, what kind of skills and personality people need. Are there any traits that maybe aren't so desirable in an interpreter, or any pitfalls that people should avoid? Matthew, you've trained a lot of interpreters over the years. What do you encourage people not to do?
Okay, well, yeah, it's difficult because there's this nature versus nurture thing of can somebody change? In fact, mother tongue is very, very important, as Phoebe was saying, and I think it can be difficult to unlearn your mother tongue. So if you've grown up bilingual and you inhabit a sort of grey area between two languages where both are used interchangeably, that can be a difficult position from which to become an interpreter. And if you have a very rich, nuanced, eloquent mother tongue, it can be possible to acquire passive knowledge of another language to a sufficient level to be able to interpret very effectively. Another trait I might mention, more of a personality trait, I do see unhappy interpreters sometimes. So it's not that you can't make it. you can make it and then suffer when you actually get there if you're incredibly perfectionist, if you want to share your own opinion rather than constantly being the voice of someone else, if your basic approach to language is there is a right word for everything, and if you have the impression that you're constantly failing to find that right word, then you may not have so much fun in the profession as others. But I would hate to put people off with any of this. I'd just say, you know, it has all these ups and downs like anything else in life, and maybe look at how the communication process works to think, is that for me?
And Owen, would you have anything to add there? Anything that you think maybe might make people less suited, or any, you know, bad habits to be avoided, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think if you're looking for a very structured sort of 9 to 5, Monday to Friday job, maybe interpreting isn't for you either. I mean, a lot of the meetings that we do are Monday to Friday sort of office hours, but every so often we have to work in the evenings. Sometimes you might have to work at the weekend. So if you're looking for a sort of Monday to Friday 9 to 5 office job, I'm not sure if interpreting is the best profession for you. I mean, obviously, it's quite rare that we have to work in the evenings or the weekend, but it does happen. So if you want a very set routine, I'm not sure if that's the right profession. And I would also like to talk about teamwork. Teamwork is incredibly important because we're never alone in the booth. We always work with either one or two other colleagues, and we have to help each other out. So if you're a good team player, that's incredibly important. But if you're more maybe of an introvert and you're not so comfortable working with other people, I'm not sure if it's the right profession either. And just to talk a little bit about teamwork, I mean, some of the things we have to do if, for example, a colleague might look over to you because they're not sure if they've heard something correctly, or they're not sure if they've got the figure, and we have to help each other out by writing things down. Or maybe helping each other with the documents, you know, passing the colleague over a document or something which might be useful. So teamwork is incredibly important. So if you're not maybe all that good of a team player, no matter how good your languages are, perhaps interpreting isn't for you.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that a lot of people do seem to know about interpreting is that we work for half an hour and then we're off and our colleague takes over. But even when you're not on, you still have to be listening out for things, helping colleagues. It's not that you can go out and have a cup of coffee for half an hour until it's your turn again. And I would just add what you said about working weekends and evenings is unusual. At the Parliament, it's perhaps less unusual than it is in some of the other institutions. I think what we'll do is we'll go to some of the questions. There seem to be a couple that are very similar. How long did it take you to train as your first, how long till you got your first job? Could you describe the whole process of getting a job as an interpreter, from applying, the tests, how to get a job? So perhaps we could just have, once you've got your degree or your bachelor's or your master's in interpreting, what would be the next steps? And perhaps we can also touch on, do you have to decide if you want to work for the Parliament or if you want to work for the Commission? Do you choose as soon as you take a test? What are most people's route into the profession? Owen, would you perhaps like to say a few words?
Yeah, we'll just talk a little bit about my way into the profession. So I finished my master's degree in 2017, and then I passed the test the following spring. Which is actually, it's quite quick by sort of interpreting terms, but you also got to find a way of keeping your skills up to date, obviously paying the rent and whatever. And what Phoebe said was quite interesting. I did some volunteer gigs as well. So volunteering is really useful. It's a good way to test your skills and to make sure that you can deliver something professional. Even though it's a volunteering gig, it should be of professional standard. And it's a good way to expand your general knowledge, to get to know colleagues, to network. And I would really recommend following what's going on in the institutions during that time as well, in the run-up to your accreditation test. So you can do things like follow the midday press briefing, which is broadcast live through the European Commission's service. And that's a good way to keep on top of EU knowledge. And then, yes, once you get accredited, it sort of depends on how much demand there is at the moment at that particular time. But I was able to get get my first assignment quite quickly. Within sort of a month or so of getting accredited, I started getting offered my first assignments, and it sort of snowballed from there. But you probably need to have another way of making a living at the beginning as well. I think no one lives from interpreting probably for the first year, 2 years, perhaps. Try to have some other job that you can do, perhaps do some translations or proofreading or something which is flexible enough to allow you then to accept those first assignments.
Yeah, I mean, Matthew, I don't know if you have anything to add. Perhaps you could say a few words. We've talked about being accredited. Perhaps you could say a few words about how someone would go about getting accredited to work for the European institutions.
Sure. So check the profile first. Ideally, do that even before you get your training so that you know you're aiming in the right direction. You've heard something about some examples for the different booths of what is required. And if you're eligible, then apply for the accreditation test. And that is inter-institutional. So once you hopefully pass and you are on the list, then you are available to work for any of those institutions. So you don't have to have a prior idea about where you would prefer to work. You can try to give them all a try. And what you do need to do, though, is make sure that you have the right profile to be able to apply. And it may be, particularly for the English booth, that 2 languages may well be enough, and you can then work on adding a 3rd language or something else later on. I haven't mentioned my combination yet. I work from French, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese into English, and English into Spanish. So sometimes people do work into a 2nd language when there is a need. But you've heard about the profiles. The bar to getting in would be extremely good mother tongue, as you've heard, and then something that complies with the profile. And there is a bit of a paradox, I think, too, in that early stage. I want to encourage people that you sort of need a certain amount of experience to be able to put your knowledge to play. If you're completely fresh out of school, you may have a few vulnerabilities in your technique that will be exposed, and that would mean that you're not quite ready to work for an international organization. But at the same time, how are you supposed to get that experience if the organization doesn't say, yes, please come and work for us tomorrow? And so you've heard some suggestions from the others about volunteering, about doing some translation work. I would also say, if you're interested in a particular institution, follow it very closely as a citizen. We've got European elections coming up next year. And even if you're in a country where you will not be voting yourself, in London, for instance, you can still take an interest in the whole process and see how it works as an individual. And I think getting close to how institutions work, not from the interpreting perspective, is one of the key points which will give you that little extra, so that when you show off your interpreting skills on the day of the test, you're also showing off some familiarity with how the institution works.
Yeah, and I would just point out, to reassure anyone who's an interpreting student right now, there's a lot of scare stories, I think, about the accreditation tests at the European institutions. The accreditation tests are incredibly time-consuming and costly to organize. And the point of them is to recruit people. We're not doing it to keep you out. In the tests, we're not going to be picking up on any little word that we can use to fail you. We want to recruit people with potential. So if you've been able to pass your exams at your interpreting school, then the accreditation tests are of a similar standard. If you've been to a reputable, recognized interpreting school, then the accreditation tests will be very, very similar to everything that your trainers will have taught you over the year. So please don't be too afraid of what to expect if you come for an accreditation test. Phoebe, I don't know if you have anything to add on that, or we can start picking up on some of the other questions that have been put.
No, I would just wholeheartedly agree with what Matthew and Owen said, and yourself, and yes, agree with everything.
We have a question that I think we could have expected. What is the situation since Brexit? Do you have to have European citizenship, or what is the case for Brits these days? Who would like to say a few words about recruitment since Brexit. Phoebe, go ahead.
I mean, I can say I'm British. I don't have any other nationality up my sleeve. You don't have to have your nationality is not an obstacle for you to become a freelance working for the institutions. So British people can continue to apply as a freelancer. Becoming a staff member is a little bit more tricky. You do have to have EU nationality, but I'm perhaps going to add Luxembourgish at some point as to my citizenship array. So there are ways around it, of course, as we all know, if that's where you ultimately think you'd like to end up.
Yeah, I mean, we've always had American, South African, Australian colleagues. I know our Spanish colleagues have people from Latin America working in the booth. There's no nationality requirement to become a freelance. For staff, it's a little more complicated, but most people start working as freelancers anyway. So yeah, so that's not an impediment to working for the institutions. What about non-European languages? We have a question about if your mother tongue is Cantonese or Mandarin. We often have questions about Russian and Arabic. And what are the opportunities for people who don't have European languages?
Yes, well, there is an accreditation process for that as well. I would say it's not as frequent as for European EU languages. It's sort of based more on supply and demand. But certainly at the Commission, we end up in a lot of meetings with, in particular, Arabic or perhaps Chinese or Japanese or some of the accession languages. So I would say if that's your case, just keep an eye on the website. You'll get a link to the website for the accreditation tests. And yeah, I think a lot of the time you have to work both ways, I think, for non-EU languages. But once again, keep an eye on the website. There are opportunities out there. And yeah, it's maybe not something you're going to be doing all the time. You won't be recruited by the EU institutions on a very regular basis, but still, it's another employer to add to your list. So it's definitely worthwhile getting accredited at the EU institutions with one of those languages.
We have a question from someone who lives in Latin America. Would you have to fly to Europe for jobs, or are there meetings abroad? Matthew, this is someone with a AA English and Spanish, so perhaps with your Spanish B, you would be best placed to answer this question for us.
Well, similar to the situation for non-EU official languages, there are meetings which are held geographically outside the EU. So it is useful for the EU to have accredited interpreters on other continents ready for when delegations or other people visit. So I certainly think there are opportunities within our orbit, if you like, but most of the business happens at the main seats of the EU. So one may want to think about other global organizations, UN, but then working both ways between English and Spanish isn't necessarily so useful for them. So I would do more research on international organizations, but it certainly could be of use occasionally for the EU, I would say.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, this goes for people living outside of the EU and within the EU as well. We do recruit people to come from the UK or Spain, for example, to come and work in Brussels. But obviously, the people who get the contracts first are the one who live in Brussels, unless we're talking about a very unusual language. But if you are serious about making your career mainly working for the European institutions, then you probably need to be in Brussels or in Luxembourg. We have a question about internships. Phoebe, are there any internships for opportunities for master's students, and are there any criteria? Do you know anything about that?
Actually, that's a really good question to ask me specifically as the representative of the Court of Justice, because we have a traineeship at the court that I would encourage anybody who has got their master's degree to apply for if you're interested in experiencing working at the court. It's a great internship. It's booth based, so you will be in the booth practicing dummy boothing in real life hearings, and it's a great way of, if you've already got your qualification and you want to get some experience, it's a really great opportunity. You can find more information about it on the Curia website, which is the court's website. You do need EU nationality to apply for it, but there's no hurt in trying if you're a particularly impassioned UK national as well, I would say. The important thing is that you need to have your qualification. I very eagerly tried to apply for it when I still did not have the piece of paper, and I was told to go away and come back the next year, which I did, and I eventually did the traineeship. So I can tell you firsthand that it's a really great opportunity to look out for.
And Owen, are there any opportunities like that at the Commission?
Yes, we have what are called Blue Book traineeships, where you can work at any DG of the European Commission, but you can specifically request our department, the interpreting service. And most of the positions are administrative positions within the interpreting service, but there is an initiative now to start running interpreting, a limited number of interpreting traineeships as well. But even if you're in an administrative position, it would be a good idea to get in touch with the head of the relevant language unit and see if you can do some shadowing, or that's we follow an interpreter for a day, sit in on their meetings, or do what we call dummy booth, where you sit in a booth by yourself and you follow the meeting and you can do some interpreting. So there are traineeship opportunities at the European Commission as well.
And what about the Parliament, Matthew?
Yes, so Schumann traineeships at the European Parliament, different name, similar idea. You need to be an EU national, and these are, good news is, paid internships. Bad news for somebody completely focused on interpreting, they're generally not hands-on day-to-day booth experience internships, but they are or can be indirectly related. So it is possible to come into the interpreting service and help with organizing meeting requests, conference services, programming meetings, organizing virtual classes, all sorts of interpreting related business, which will give you insights into how we work. So I would definitely encourage aspiring interpreters to apply, and many former trainees have gone on to become accredited interpreters.
Okay, thank
Sorry,
you.
if I can just add something. I see my head of unit is in the room and has written something in the chat that there are no nationality requirements for the Blue Book traineeships.
Excellent news for all the Brits joining us. Right, we have a rather long question from Cara, who is fluent in French and English and also has a degree in Spanish and German, and will be starting a master's in interpreting in September next year. She's worked as a sworn translator and an interpreter for the Court of Appeal in Monaco, and has experience in interpreting in the police station. Now, given this very limited experience, what should she do before she starts her master's? Cara, I will just say that is a great deal more experience than I had when I started my interpreting master's. But has anyone got any tips if someone's thinking of starting interpreting next year? What are the best things they can do to prepare before the course? Matthew?
I would say think in terms of broader ideas rather than words. So when you listen to another language, try to get the gist, try to get at the intention of the speaker. Think about that, have discussions about that, maybe listen to things in different languages and then discuss them in your mother tongue afterwards. I wouldn't try to practice interpreting per se yet, but expose yourself to a range of materials in your languages and engage actively with the content, and especially with speakers' intentions. Have all these questions in your mind. Why is someone saying this? How are they saying it? What effect will this have on the listeners? These are all general communication skills that one can work on alone, especially with online resources.
And if I could just ask, you said don't try interpreting per se yet. Why is that?
Okay, well, you could always have like a conversation where you say something back in another language afterwards. So I wouldn't say, don't do any interpreting at all. But I have occasionally heard of people who will turn on the TV news and try to parrot it in another language and say, okay, I'm practicing simultaneous interpretation. And the thing is, that's not simultaneous. You really do need guidance from a trainer. Simultaneous is not hearing words and then parroting words in another language, which is the instinctive reaction that many people have when they first go into the booth. So I would say do that under the pedagogical guidance of a training course. But there's nothing to stop you engaging with ideas and transferring ideas from one language to another. I would just say don't be obsessed with the form or the mode of interpreting. Leave the note-taking and the simultaneous until you receive formal training, but do engage with multilingual ideas.
Okay, thank you very much. And Cara, I would just say with the experience that you already have, I think you will be very well placed when you start out on your degree next year, and good luck with it all. Phoebe, we have a question. We were supposed to be finishing at about 12:45, so we'll maybe just quickly get through the last couple of questions before we wrap up, if that's all right with our panelists. Phoebe, you mentioned that you were learning Spanish, and we have a question about being trained in new languages while working as an interpreter. Is that only for staff interpreters, or is that open to freelancers as well?
Well, I personally, as you said, I am learning Spanish. I'm doing a language course through the court. But when I was a freelancer as well, I learned Portuguese. I didn't do it with the institutions. I did it on my own, but I know that I think Matthew and Owen might be better placed to comment on this. The court itself, as far as I'm aware, doesn't offer any bursaries for freelancers to learn languages. I think that's done more by the Commission and the Parliament. So maybe I can hand over to them.
Sure. Owen, would you like to say a few words on opportunities for freelancers?
Yes, absolutely. I added German to my combination through the Commission, and I actually started doing that while I was a freelancer, and then continued once I joined the staff. So I've sort of seen both sides of it. And there are language courses that you can join if you're in Brussels, but obviously you need to be there. For freelancers, we have training vouchers where you get a set amount of money to be able to go off and spend time in the country, maybe do a language course, have one-to-one lessons. You choose how to use the money, basically, as long as it's a reasonable use of the money. It will be approved. You need to account for how you've used that money. You need to write up a report afterwards. So that money is available because obviously it's in the interest of the institutions to not only improve the language skills of the staff, but also of the freelancers.
And Matthew, anything to add about how it works at the Parliament?
I think very similar. I would like to add one thing from earlier, if I may. Owen added about the nationality requirement for traineeships, and I don't have my head of unit breathing down my neck and correcting me when I get things wrong. So the danger is I will walk away having got it wrong and not having corrected myself. According to the website, a very limited number of Schumann traineeships to nationals of other countries can also be offered. So it sounds as though you shouldn't give up either if you don't have an EU nationality for a Schumann traineeship. And more generally, some of these rules, you do have to delve into websites, similar for what exactly is on offer for freelancers adding languages. I would say there is at least moral support and possibly more opportunities, and do get in touch with us. We're here as humans today to put a human face on websites that contain lots of useful information, but sometimes interpreting it and applying it to your case can seem daunting. So do stay in touch with all of us, and we can try to give people more specialized advice on their trajectory.
I would like to point out that my head of unit is gently encouraging me in the background and not breathing down my neck.
Hi, Morag.
And just briefly to come back to the question about language learning for freelancers, you can also join the classes if you're not working on that day. And for example, I have a Dutch class every Friday morning, and we have several freelancers who occasionally have to miss because they're working. But if they're free, they are, of course, always welcome to join the class if they have the right level. Okay, the last couple of questions. How family friendly is work in the booth? If you have small children, how does that work out with your schedule? I don't know if we have anyone with small children on the panel here. No, okay. Would anyone like to? I mean, I think basically it varies from institution to institution. The Parliament, we frequently work in the evenings, and of course there's travel to Strasbourg. I don't know. I think the court may be a bit more predictable in timing, Phoebe. I don't know.
I was going to say we do have lots of colleagues with small children, so it's very possible. I mean, there's ways of accommodating somebody to a certain extent with their program. Our hearings usually take place in the morning, so that's our main constraint for hearings. There's a bit more flexibility in the afternoon, maybe, but I think it depends on. We're not. I mean, if somebody has small children, I think their needs will be taken into account as far as possible, and it's like any other job in that sense. I would say there's less travel at the court, so it is possibly a better place for if you do have a young family.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have anything to add, Owen. This picks up on Sophia's question about do you work Monday to Friday or core hours? I mean, the core hours are basically Monday to Friday. Owen, I don't know if you've got anything you would like to add on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not affected by this personally, but a lot of colleagues have young children, and there are quite a few family-friendly policies in place. Colleagues can work part-time up until their children are 12 years old. There's parental leave. I won't go into all the details because it's quite complex, but yes, and the core hours are generally sort of Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, with some exceptions.
Yeah, and then so we have one final question about what you can do between university and starting a master's degree. I mean, I think we've touched on this a great deal. Phoebe, you said you went straight from university into your master's, correct? Whereas others had more time. I don't know if anyone wants to say anything specific about that. I mean, whatever you can do. If you can go abroad, that's great, but it's not always financially possible. Or I don't know if anyone has any tips for that.
I'll maybe just chip in at this point. I would say following any kind of formal meeting. So if you can go online and find, and even if it's just in English or just in one language, just to get an idea of that register. So I heard, for example, that I think it was at Heriot Watt in Edinburgh, they were taking their students to the Scottish Parliament just for them to sit in on sessions to get an idea of how that sort of environment works, the type of language used. And now you can follow a lot of those sessions online. So any exposure you can get to that type of language, you know, where it's a little bit political or a little bit technical, where there's quite a high register, I think that's incredibly useful. And you don't have to do it, you know, all day, every day. You can just tune in, you know, once a week for an hour or two. It's incredibly important to get that right sort of register. Yeah,
definitely. And Matthew, any kind of final tips or comments before we wrap it up? Anything
There's
you
a
think
good comment in the chat just now, reading in your A language. Yes, and in your other languages, I think reading and reading literature too. This makes me very unpopular with some colleagues, but I think Proust is sort of almost describing interpreting, because the layers of memory and differing interpretations of the same comments and so on. So getting your head around where French speakers are coming from, I found plunging into French literature very helpful. But everybody will find that the way that's most fun for them, and register, as Owen said, is very important. So following proceedings in the kind of language that you may end up using on mic will be very helpful. Yeah.
I think one good thing about reading is that it's much slower. With interpreting, everything's just flying past you so quickly, and sometimes you don't catch a word, or you think, oh, what would be a really good way of rendering that in English, but by the time you finish interpreting, you've forgotten it. Whereas reading at least gives you time to stop and think, and translation's good from that perspective as well. Phoebe, any final remarks, comments, tips before we wrap it up?
Yes, I agree with all of you. Reading is great. I can't claim to be as highbrow as Proust. I tend to read Stephen King in other languages. That's my go-to when I need to pick up a book. But again, it's reading something you know, a style in another language can be interesting as well. And yes, just keep abreast of what's happening in the rest of Europe, more specifically in the languages you work from, or that you're intending to work from. And as I said, if you're curious about the court, for example, you can check out our web streamed hearings, which take place. I think they go up every Tuesday afternoon. You can see the Grand Chamber hearing from the Tuesday morning. So that can be a nice way in to see how the court specifically functions. And you can listen to the interpreters working as well, because the interpreters are there for the judges, the parties, the language of the case. So you'll see you can tune into different booths and hear them working, which can be interesting to hear real life interpreters work. And yeah, just if you've got a course lined up or you want to go into interpreting, just keep excited about it. Keep the momentum going is what I would say.
Yeah, and you can also do the same for the Parliament. The plenary is live streamed, and a lot of the committee meetings are also streamed now. So you can also see the difference between the more technical work in committee and the more political work in the plenary chamber. Okay, so finally, Owen, any final comments before we say goodbye to our audience?
Yeah, well, coming back to what Matthew was saying about literature, I got a Molière reference the other day. So these things do come up, these literary references are very ingrained in people's culture. And even things like, I'm not the most religious person, but even knowing Bible quotes, like every so often they come up. So knowing them in different languages. So just be curious about everything, be open to everything, and don't say, oh, that's not for me. As an interpreter, everything needs to be for you, at least sort of on a surface level. Obviously, you can't go into great depth on everything, but you need to be open to everything and curious about everything.
Okay, thank you all very much. And thank you especially to our audience for participating and all of the really interesting questions. I'm going to briefly put up a QR code that you can click on that has lots of links to all the websites and all the information that you need. And they're also available in the chat. Diana's posted them in the chat. But otherwise, I think it's just a case of saying thank you very much. And we very much hope that that's what your enthusiasm, and that we will see you all in the booth at some point. Okay, so there's the QR code. And I hope you all have a nice weekend and hopefully see you all sometime soon.